So I am really excited to moderate for you today and to welcome you to the Ontario Caregiver Organization's webinar series. So these are webinars that we offer on a regular basis, and they bring together caregivers and subject matter experts to explore topics of interest to caregivers. So we do this to support and engage chosen family, friends, and neighbors who are caring for someone. And again, I am Katie, and I will be your moderator for today. Happy to be here with you. So just before we begin, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the lands that we're on today. And while we meet on a virtual platform, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land for which we all call home. So the Ontario Caregiver Organization carries out its work while acknowledging the Indigenous people of all the lands that we are on today. This land is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, and acknowledging this reminds us of our great standard of living, which is directly related to the resources and friendships of Indigenous people. If you'd like to learn more about the lands that you're joining from, you can visit nativeland.ca for more information. Oh, right. And to dive a little bit more into the specifics of today, as I've mentioned a couple times, our webinar is called Navigating Special Education in Ontario Schools. So Ontario's education system can be complex and confusing for families with students with disabilities. To help address these challenges, Community Living Ontario has developed a comprehensive guide, which they call Navigating Special Education in Ontario, and OCO is pleased to welcome on Community Living Ontario to provide important information and tips and strategies that can support caregivers of students who are navigating the special education system, both in elementary and secondary schools. So some things that you can expect from today to learn more about the process, procedures, and key concepts of the Ontario school system, which will enhance your understanding as a parent or caregiver. We'll also be exploring Community Living Ontario's new guide, Strategies for Success, Navigating Special Education in Ontario Schools, which is a guide for our students, parents, and caregivers. And also our guest speaker will be sharing practical tips for effective advocacy for your child's needs. And I'm happy now to introduce our guest speaker and to turn it over to him. Our guest speaker today is Sean Pegg, and he's the Director of Social Policy and Strategic Initiative at Community Living Ontario. Sean's worked for more than 20 years as a social researcher and advocate with extensive experience developing policy and programs that relate to health, income, food security, affordable housing, and social services. So a wide background there. And Sean's also the author of several recent reports on developmental services in Ontario, including Tangled in Red Tape, which is related to employment services, Ending the Wait, which is related to what we see very commonly now, or very publicly shared now, the services, the wait list that exist for developmental services in Ontario, and also the Right to Decide, which is a report on supported decision making. So without further ado, I am happy to turn it over to Sean to take us into today's topic. And just before I pass it over to Sean, please feel free again to use the chat. We are here and excited to receive your comments and questions. And Sean, over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Katie. And thanks so much for having me on today. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to parents and caregivers who are connected with the Ontario Caregiver Organization. So yeah, I'm really happy to be here today. So as Katie said, I work with Community Living Ontario. We're an organization that was founded by families of people with developmental disabilities in the 1950s. So we've been around for quite a long time now. And we're very proud to work with people with developmental disabilities, family members, and developmental service agencies to improve people's health and quality of life, which is our overall overriding goal. So today, like Katie said, I'm going to talk about the guide that we've produced in partnership with Poor & Law on the special education system in Ontario. I'm going to talk about I'm going to delve a little bit into the guide And I'm also going to talk about the broader context of special education in Ontario right now because things are changing so much and so much is up in the air with the new Minister of Education. We know changes are coming, but we're not sure what those changes are yet, which I'm sure is stressful and anxiety producing for parents. So I will address some of those issues, and I'll also provide some practical tips based on my own experience supporting families with children who are accessing special education. So, along with the Strategies for Success guide, we have also we published in the spring a report called Crisis in the Classroom, which I will get into a little bit earlier, sorry, a little bit later, which looks at children's experiences of inclusion and belonging in schools, and also their experiences of exclusion, seclusion, and restraint in Ontario schools. I'll get into that a little bit later on. And I just want to acknowledge again the role of poor and law in the development of this guide on special education, and specifically Jenna Bonterin, a lawyer at Poor and Law, who is responsible for the lion's share of the content in the guide. The guide was also financially supported by the Law Foundation of Ontario, but of course, the contents of the guide are the responsibility of Poor and Law and Community Living Ontario. And the contents of today's presentation are the sole responsibility of Community Living Ontario. And there's a link to the online version of the guide on your screen in the yellow box right there. And I'm sure if you Googled Community Living Ontario special education guide, it would come up as well. And just before I jump into things, I just want to note that if you do ask, so there are two versions of our guide. One is an online version, and the other is a PDF. So the link to the PDF is on your screen in orange. And I just want to note that the web version, the HTML version, has been published on a site that has a translate tool. And if you go into this translate tool, once you're in there, it will translate the guide into a number of languages. With any luck, it will be the language of your choice, the language you're most comfortable in. And if the language you're most comfortable in isn't available, please reach out to me and let me know. Okay, so just as an overall thought on the presentation today, I think if there's one thing I'd like parents and caregivers to take away from this today, it's really the importance of context when advocating for a child or youth with disabilities in the school system. You know, every situation, every family situation is different and unique. But at the same time, every situation is taking place in the same provincial policy, funding, and political context. And it's important to understand how the broader context might be influencing your particular situation because it will have an impact on your approach and on the outcomes, depending on the approach you take. Um, so as I said, you know, every situation is unique, and for sure, there is a progression that I think is pretty consistent among students and families in the school system. You know, just entering into school and in the early years, there's a real focus on obtaining diagnoses, understanding what support is available, you know, navigating access to the supports that are available in school versus those that are available out of school and different ways of accessing them. You know, as you move through the school system and you get into the sort of the middle school region, you know, you're going to experience increasing academic expectations. You're going to start thinking about high school. And a big one is managing changing social and cultural norms amongst peers, which can be really tricky at times. And then getting into high school, you're going to experience increasing differentiation in class placements and in workforce preparation streams. You're going to be thinking about what happens after high school. And a lot of families come into contact with, you know, consistently lowered expectations for students with disabilities as they move along through high school. So, things are different depending on where you are in the school system. And I think, you know, even with all of this complexity and all of the things I'm going to talk about today, I think it's really helpful and grounding to always start with values. And so I'm just going to run through some values that are kind of held close to our heart at Community Living Ontario. So first, all children and youth have something to contribute to their communities. All children and youth have the right to be in school and to be valued. All children and youth have the right to access the support they need to succeed in school. Parents and caregivers know their children best, and all children and youth can and should take increasing control of their own education as they age and mature. I think these values stay true throughout a student's school experience, throughout their school journey. And if you always come back to this, I find that it's really grounding, regardless of what you're facing in terms of the education system and special education. And I think, right now these things are super important because of um, all the upheaval and change that is happening in the school system right now. The Ministry of Education taking over 4 school boards and removing the power of trustees is a huge one, but it's only one of those changes. So I think we always have to be going back to values and always putting forward the value and contributions of students with disabilities and the importance of students with disabilities in the education system through all of this change. So, there's also, I think, real risk for students with disabilities in the education system. Our Crisis in the Classroom report really gets into this pretty extensively. Crisis in the Classroom is based on a survey of more than 500 parents and caregivers from across Ontario, caregivers of students with disabilities. And amongst those parents and caregivers, almost a third told us that their child had been secluded or isolated, is another word for it, while in school. 14% reported that their child had been restrained while in school, and almost a third reported that their child had been sent home or told to stay home because the school was unable to meet their needs. So there's a lot to be going. There's a lot. There are definitely things to be worried about. And again, I think coming back to values is very grounding. And we're not alone in pointing to issues in Ontario's education system. The Ontario Autism Coalition came out with a kind of a similar report last year. And a few years ago, Autism Advocacy Ontario did a report called Children in Crisis. This was not sort of widely read, but it is available on the Community Living Ontario website on our advocacy page. So, with that introduction done, I'm going to launch into what is contained in Strategies for Success, our guide to special education in Ontario, which again was developed in partnership with Poor and Law. I'm not going to go super deep into what's in there. I just want to give you a sense of what's contained in it because I really do think it has information, background, context for almost every situation you might come into contact with as a parent or caregiver of a student with a disability. So it goes into the Education Act. It talks about Education Act regulations. It talks about policy and program memoranda. So, for example, it talks about what an exceptional pupil is, which, to this day, I still find kind of a really weird concept. And it's something that, but it's so important to understand if you're going to be able to access the services and supports your kids need. It talks about what a special education program is and what special education services are. It goes into the length of the school day, which I'll get to a little more later. And so one thing it talks about are qualifications of teachers. And so something that I've seen quite a bit or heard about quite a bit is situations where a student with a disability is accessing a special education teacher, but that special education teacher clearly does not have the qualifications and training needed to understand the learning and emotional needs of all students. And so as a parent, our guide enables you to have a look at what is required of special education teachers, which gives you a basis to go to the principal and say, look, um, this is what is required in the regulations of the Education Act amongst special education teachers or other staff. Clearly, the person currently in the position does not have these qualifications. So let's work together to figure out how we can rectify the situation. That's kind of the spirit that this guide is meant in, to give you kind of the for lack of a better word, ammunition that you can use in advocating for your child. And I just wanted to look at a couple of key high level things, one in the Education Act and one in the Human Rights Code. So first of all, in the Education Act, it says that the minister shall ensure that all exceptional children have available to them appropriate special education programs and services without payment of fees. And shall is so important here because it means the Minister of Education must do this. This is required. So all students with disabilities must have access to appropriate special education programs and services. This is the baseline. I know that this does not happen in reality in many, many cases, but that doesn't discount the importance of understanding that this is a requirement set out in legislation. And within the scope of the Ontario Human Rights Code, the Ontario Human Rights Commission has pointed out that education providers have a duty to accommodate students with disabilities up to the point of undue hardship. And undue hardship is really about when something starts to, arguably cost too much. And I just want to go back to the word duty here, that there is a duty that, educate schools must accommodate the needs of students with disabilities. And the Human Rights Commission has noted that students with disabilities are not always being provided with appropriate accommodations, and they are falling victim to disputes between various parties responsible for accommodation, which I'm sure some folks on this webinar today have experienced. So I just wanted to again go back to this idea that access to programs and services is a must, and access to accommodations is a must. The guide also goes into quite a bit into who does what. So I think it provides a nice template in situations where parents and caregivers might not know where to go. Maybe they've worked with the teacher, they've worked with the principal, and things haven't gone the way they expected. And often I find people don't know exactly where to go next. And so the guide talks about who does what in the education system, and also where to go when things aren't problems, issues aren't being resolved in a way that you think is appropriate. So, for example, it talks about sort of the line of decision making from teacher to principal to superintendent of schools to director of education for the board to the trustee. And I would say that this chart is a little bit oversimplified. I think a more accurate way would be having kind of a bunch of circled arrows between the teacher and the principal, because a lot of work is done in advocating directly with the classroom teacher, with the principal, figuring out how things can work in specific situations. And then once that runs its course, the superintendent, director, and trustee would be the next steps. And I've also provided a link to a really good page from the Toronto Catholic District School Board, which I think is really helpful, even if you're not, even if your child isn't in that school board. So right now, with the way things are going, we've got trustee on here, and so this is not going to be an option right now for people who are in the four school boards that have been taken over by the ministry and where the trustees have had their powers removed. So in these situations, I would encourage parents and caregivers to focus more on the superintendent and the director. I think on a personal note, I haven't put this in the slides, but on a personal note, I think that the Minister of Education and members of provincial parliament are interested in the experiences of parents and caregivers of students with disabilities. And I think it's very important for people to be writing to the Minister of Education, to your member of provincial parliament about your experiences in schools, because they are in this period of, this period of change, this period of thinking about what's going to happen next. And I think it's crucially important that parents and caregivers have a say in where that goes. So I would encourage you to do that. And in those four school boards that have been taken over by the ministry, there's also a supervisor. So you might want to consider also thinking about writing the supervisor, though I'm not sure how closely they are involved in day-to-day activities and day-to-day operations. And just to build on that a bit, when trustees are not an option in terms of advocacy, you can also contact your school board's Human Rights and Equity Office. You can contact the Ombudsman of Ontario if things are going kind of really wrong and you need help pretty quickly. And your school board should also have a whistleblower page where you can make complaints confidentially. So next, I'm going to go into individual education plans and the identification, placement, and review committee process. I'm not going to go super deep into these. I just want to note a couple of things, knowing that there's a lot more information in the guide itself. So first, I just want to point out that every student who's been identified as exceptional by an IPRC must have an individual education plan. At the same time, you don't need to go through the Identification Placement Review Committee process to get an individual education plan for your child. So again, just because a student hasn't been formally identified, they still have the right to an IEP. The guide goes into the difference between accommodations and modifications in individual education plans, which I think is important. So accommodations change how a student is taught. So accommodations do not change the learning expectations for the grade level. The curriculum is not changed or modified. So this could include things like, longer periods of time for testing, being able to take a test in a quiet room, those kinds of things. On the other hand, modifications change what the student is taught. So modifications change the learning expectations for the grade level, and the curriculum may be changed or modified. And this modifications will have implications for a student's progression through school. So it's really important to review the IEP when it comes to you and make sure you understand any modifications that have been made, because they could certainly have implications for certification, for diploma achievement, and that kind of thing. So those are pretty important to keep an eye on. And I'm just going to go into the IPRC process a little bit. The guide talks about who you can expect to attend the IPRC meeting. I see I've got a typo in there that I need to fix. It talks about how to prepare for the IPRC, reviewing the decision, what to do if you disagree with the decision, definitions of exceptionalities, and available classroom placements. And so, the IPRC process can be pretty anxiety provoking, I think, for parents and caregivers and for students as well, over 16 who are participating in them. One thing many have pointed out is that in the IPRC process, students and their caregivers are forced to present themselves in the worst possible light to get the support they need. This can have unintended consequences, including reduced academic and social expectations for students. And again, if I'm thinking about going back to values and how important values are as a base in all of this work, I think you can work against this focus on the negative, this focusing on the negative, by always starting with the positive. Coming into that meeting, talking about what does your child love to do? What are their interests? How do they contribute to your household and to the wider community? What do they admire? what are their goals? What do they see for their life? I think if you always start there, I mean, you're still going to have to go through the kind of supports they need to achieve those goals, but I think it can help set the tone and get people on the right track and in the right frame of mind, rather than always looking at, deficits and needs and problems. And another thing I also wanted to point out about the IPRC is that you will probably be asked to sign the statement of decision. However, you are not required to sign it when it's provided to you. You should only sign the statement of decision if you're satisfied with all of the decisions of the IPRC. And again, the guide goes into the process for what to do and who to talk to. If you are not happy with an IPRC statement of decision, you can do a second IPRC meeting. And if that still doesn't go kind of according to plan, there is the Special Education Appeal Board and the Ontario Special Education Tribunal, which the guide goes into in more detail. Um, the IPRC process, again, has been criticized for being very focused on the negative and maybe for being overly formal. And some parents and caregivers might question whether the process is right for you, and that's a decision that is going to be specific to every family situation. Um, uh, uh, poor law who were involved in developing this again made the point that a lot of caregivers value having the IPRC process in place if they disagree with decisions made by the school board. It gives an opportunity for an annual review, and there are appeal rights if you disagree with the IPRC decision. But again, it's important to remember that a student doesn't need an IPRC review to receive accommodation while in school or to have access to an IEP. So really, it's going to be a decision that is specific to every family in every situation. So lastly, I'm going to talk about the right to be in school, specifically about, I'm going to talk mainly about exclusions, seclusion, and restraint. But just to give you a sense of what's in the guide again, it goes into decisions in pretty great detail. It talks about when a principal may suspend or when a principal must suspend. And I think it's important to note that you can appeal a suspension to the school board. I think a lot of folks don't know that you have to make an appeal in writing to the superintendent of the school board within 10 days of the start of the suspension, and then the appeal must be heard within 15 school days after your written notice has been received. My understanding is that the format of the written appeal isn't as important as the need to get it in to the superintendent of the school board within 10 school days. So I just wanted to point that out because I don't think that's widely known. The guide also goes into what is required of schools for students who have been suspended, especially if they've been suspended for more than 10 school days. Being suspended doesn't mean that a student's education ends. It just means that their education needs to be happening outside of the school, but the education continues even during a suspension. It also goes into expulsions from school, and I'm just going to point out that expulsions can be appealed to the Child and Family Services Review Board, and again, the guide goes into that in more detail. So I just want to talk about a little bit about exclusions and modified days, because based on what I'm hearing and what I'm reading, I think this is one of the most this is one of the things that parents, caregivers, and students are coming into contact with the most. Things like parents are being called to pick up their child early from school because the school doesn't have the resources needed to meet that child's learning and emotional needs. Or a parent is getting a call at 8 o'clock in the morning from the principal saying, we had an EA call in, so we're a little bit shorthanded today, so I'm not sure we're going to be able to support your child's needs this morning. They may or may not say, they may or may not request that you keep your child home. It really differs depending on the principal. And we see this happening right across the province. Some talk about the use of this so-called exclusion provision, which is Section 265 1M of the Education Act. And I think there are times when principals are referring back to this piece of the act, but other times to me, it just seems more informal. And it's a principal response to the fact that they're shorthanded on a lot of days in a lot of parts of the province. So it's a thing that's very hard to put your finger on. So I just want to walk through approaches parents and caregivers can take if this is happening to your child. And but before I do that, I also just want to step back for a moment and just kind of reflect on Ontario's education system and how it supports all students, including students with disabilities. And just looking at our crisis in the classroom report again, so you can see in this chart that many parents reported that the school had sent the student home, citing behavior issues. The school had instructed the student not to attend school, or they sent the student home because of a lack of staff or resources. And these are kind of, certainly overlapping issues here. But also, I found it very interesting that many caregivers reported giving their kids a day off from school to give them a rest because school made them anxious. It was, very complex to navigate socially, educationally. Often, caregivers told us that their kids were reluctant to go to school. They avoided school, and sometimes the parent refused to send their kid to school because they felt like the school couldn't meet their needs. So what we're seeing is, not only schools indicating that they're not able to support students, but caregivers making decisions about attendance just based on their kids' experiences in school, which, for me is a sign of a big need for change. And so we're certainly keeping our eye closely on what the Minister of Education has been saying about what he has planned. And we've been putting forward quite a few recommendations on changes that we believe could be made to improve the experiences for all students, including students with disabilities. Um, Okay, so back to this idea of exclusion. Sorry for that. Sorry for that tangent there. Um, so just so you know, there is the right to an appeal and exclusion of a student. And what I've been told by folks who are very involved in this is the importance of getting an exclusion decision in writing. So if a principal is calling you up to come pick up your child, or they're calling you in the morning saying maybe they shouldn't come in, try as hard as you can to get that in writing from the principal with a reason why they're excluding your child from school. It's very important if you can to get that in writing. Now, one thing that is really up in the air right now related to this is the fact that the appeal of an exclusion decision is heard by the Board of Trustees. And of course, for four large school boards in the province, trustees do not have any power. And so there are no boards of trustees really in effect. Um, so I guess my advice there for parents and caregivers who are in one of those four school boards is to ask the principal about avenues to appeal your child's exclusion. I'm thinking, going to the superintendent, going to the director would be logical steps, especially if you're looking for a constructive way of getting the supports your child needs while they're in school. And I just wanted to make a note as well about one thing I've been hearing related to this. I've heard that some parents and caregivers are pretty quick to keep their child home or pick them up early when asked to, whereas others have the philosophy that it is the school's responsibility to teach and care for their child during school hours. And so they are not so ready to keep their child home or go pick them up. because they feel like it's the school's, again, responsibility. I think this is really a personal decision that, again, is unique to every situation. And, just being real, many caregivers are just not able to keep their kid home or to pick them up early from school. Some folks just are not going to be able to do that given their other responsibilities. Okay, and lastly, before I go into a few tips for you, I just want to go into this issue of sensory rooms, isolation rooms, and just a few tips here. So I think for everyone on the call, I just want you to be aware, if you're not already, that many schools have rooms where they place students forcefully if they are acting in ways that might be a danger to themselves, to other students, or to school staff. So if your child is at risk of, what's been called challenging behavior or externalizing behavior, what I would do is to ask for copies of the board's policies on seclusion and restraint. Some boards have these, some boards don't. They're often called policies on risk of injury, and they're often hidden in the school board website. So you might look around risk of injury, safety, caring in safe schools, that kind of thing. They can be a bit tricky to find. And you can, of course, ask the principal for a copy. I would ask the principal if the school has a seclusion room and how it may be used. I would ask the principal about their perspective on seclusion and restraint. I would also think about developing a safety plan to create clarity for staff. And again, to set expectations with school staff early and often. And if you do know of a seclusion room in your child's school or in your board, please feel free to send me a note. We're very interested in learning about where these are located and how they're being used because this is not something that's tracked, at least as far as we know, by the board. My email address is here, and we will delink any personal info connected to what you provide, and the information you provide will never be shared. So you don't have to worry about anyone knowing that you've sent this info to me. Okay, so lastly, I'm going to go into a few tips for parents and caregivers as advocates, just pulling back a little bit and looking at things from a distance. Given everything that's happening right now, given all the upheaval, given all the unknowns, and the really kind of saying the negative things that the Minister of Education and our Premier have been saying about schools and school boards and the changes they're planning. And also, yeah, I'm going to skip over this one. Um, yeah, also, I guess now that I'm on it, I think it's also good for parents to be aware of what teachers unions are saying about their experiences in school. Teachers unions have been writing a lot about violence against teachers, and I find that while they're getting better at talking about this, I find that students with disabilities are often not blamed outright, but certainly often implicated in discussions of violence against teachers. So I think it's again important just to know that this is happening. And if you're interested in learning more about that, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario would be the first place for you to go because they're kind of leading the charge on that. Um, okay, so in terms of tips, I would say that again. Um, it's going to really be different depending on your situation. So, for example, in some situations, your teacher and principal might be very supportive of, and they might agree that your child needs more support in the classroom, for example, more services while they're in school. Your child, they might be supportive of getting more services outside of school, but they might face resource restrictions and just don't have the funding or the staff to do so. In other situations, you might face a lack of knowledge or understanding among school staff, even though resources are available. So I think it's important to understand which kind of situation you're in. And to go into even more detail, I've come up with kind of barriers at different levels based on my own experiences supporting families and my own experiences in having children in the school system. A level one, you've got a teacher who's trying to do a good job. They're pretty knowledgeable, but they have 32 students and no consistent help, like a revolving door of support staff coming in and out of the classroom, or no support staff at all. At level two, you have a teacher who might lack knowledge and might not understand your child's learning and emotional needs, which again requires kind of a different approach as a parent and advocate. At level three, you might have a classroom teacher who starts to resent your input and stops listening for whatever reason. And then at level four, you might have a teacher who is ignoring or subtly condoning disrespect and bullying of particular students in the classroom, which is incredibly problematic and is going to require some very quick and decisive action on the part of a parent and a principal. Um, and I'm skipping around a little bit here, but I also just want to provide a bit of context as well. Um, as you know, in the interest of stepping back and just looking at things from 30,000 feet, I think it's important to remember that 60,000 kids are waiting to access um, the Ontario Autism Program, which certainly has implications for young autistic kids going into schools, without having had access to occupational therapy or speech language therapy, for example. And there's also, as the Financial Accountability Office of Ontario has pointed out, a significant, more than year-long waitlist to access children's treatment and rehabilitation services. So again, these are like high-level things that teachers and principals um, don't have really any control over. And just a couple more slides on tips. As much as possible, always strive to maintain positive relationships with school staff, even though I know how hard that can be in some situations. Talk to other parents to understand what services and supports are available. And again, go back to our guide, understand who to talk to next if the teacher or principal is clearly not able or not willing to help. Whenever possible, again, in the same vein, develop positive relationships with the special education teacher at the school, ECEs, EAs, vice principals, etc. Create partnerships, create allies who in the school who know you and are willing to help you. Connect with key people on the board's Special Education Advisory Committee, and definitely send a note to representatives on the SEAC if your child's been excluded from school, if they've been put in an isolation room or anything like that happens. And if they're in place, connect with a social worker assigned to your child's school. I find they can be very helpful and they know about resources that other folks might not know about. And also, there's a link here to the Partners for Planning website, which includes information on family networks across the province. There are, regional Down syndrome family networks, Fragile X family networks, ADHD, FAS. There are all kinds of family networks that might be helpful to you if you're not involved already. And if you're not already, make sure you're accessing special services at home and other funding programs. And if available, access a Smart Start Hub or Children's Treatment and Rehabilitation Center in your region. And then just pointing out some other great resources. Autism Ontario has some great stuff. Inclusion Action Ontario has some really good stuff. And if you don't know about it yet, the Facebook page, Ontario Parents for Education Support, is really amazing. So Katie, I'm going to throw it back to you. That's my last slide.
Thank you so much, Sean, and thank you for all of that information and sharing with us. I particularly liked the kind of different levels and the multifaceted approaches that you suggested for how to work with teachers, with principals, with superintendents, and also how to advocate. So thank you for all that information. We do have some really great questions in the chat, and some of them are quite specific. So understandably, parents and caregivers asking about their specific situation. And so with their permission, I'm going to read the full question as it's written, and then feel free to, respond in a whatever general or focused approach you would like. Sean, is that Sound good?
It does, yep.
Okay, perfect. So, we have one parent here who is asking about how they might be able to get their child approved for an at-home learning program. So, how they may be able to get a teacher to come to do in-home teaching and learning. And because their child has severe anxiety and cannot get into the classroom or go to school, this parent said that they've applied and they've been told it's only for children with a time limited physical disability that doesn't allow them to attend school. And on top of anxiety, it has several other diagnoses. So, I know you've given a lot of general advocacy tips. I don't know if there was anything that kind of pops to mind in this particular situation to get in home.
Okay, yeah. So I'm gonna throw some ideas out here. Um, so if you're eligible, if your child is eligible for special services at home, that's one direction I would go in. And if you're already receiving that or you look into it, there are regional program supervisors who oversee special services at home funding, um, which can be a link to other things. And, depending on the diagnosis, there's also complex special needs funding. You can find information on complex special needs funding on the Ontario government website. Um, I think this is absolutely an issue that you can take to your member of provincial parliament. I wouldn't just send an email. I would try to go into the office and make friends with the MPP's staff in your riding and, see it as a bit of a long-term relationship development opportunity. Um, Certainly, if you haven't already, I think I'm 99% positive there's a Smart Start Hub in KW. I don't know which organization it is, but I feel like I'm almost sure there is one. I think that would be another option. I would absolutely go to your child's doctor if they have one about this. I think there are a bunch of different options. And I think in this situation, you kind of have to try a few and kind of look for an advocate in the region, either within government, the MPP's office, or a child serving organization. And you might want to look at CMHO, Children's Mental Health Ontario. Look for advice on the CMHO website, and look for CMHO members in your region who might be able to provide some assistance. So it's not necessarily going to get you to in-home instruction right away, but those would be some places that I would look.
Okay, thank you, Sean. Lots of different avenues to tackle that one. And there was a couple comments of other people also experiencing those same barriers, really feeling like it's quite difficult for their child to attend school in the regular school day setting. So thank you for all of that. The other one is a little bit more related to, and I just want to note before I go on that we have put in the chat links to a number of the resources that you just referenced, Sean. So the Smart Start Hub and CMHO, we've put some of those links in case people, and special services at home, in case people are trying to follow along. I know sometimes when the names come out, it can come fast and furious. So thank you for including the links there for us. I also just wanted to read a question, and this one I really find this one interesting because it's very general in the sense of it's related to expectations of communication from school to home. So this parent or caregiver, they've recently moved to a new school for grade 1. And they came from a school that they felt like there was what they call gold standard in communication, where they received daily notes and a communication binder, monthly events, a calendar and like caring, just a general sense of care and caring, to a school where now they're feeling like there's almost no non-existent communication unless they initiate it. It's only been a few weeks, but this caregiver, parent caregiver wants to know, what's the expectation for classroom to parent, if you can comment on that. Um, or, and is there any other, um, suggestions that you have or interesting ways that you've seen people manage this, need for extra communication that they don't feel like they're getting?
I would first want to establish if this is a school culture issue or if it's a teacher issue. It could certainly be a teacher style issue. Um, and I'm always thinking about, I think, I feel, I almost feel bad saying this, but I find that it's so easy for parents to find themselves on the outs with principals and teachers. So my advice would be to look at this as a potential culture change with the school, which takes time and it does take patience. And so you really want to make friends and pull school staff into your values bubble of like, this is what's important to me. This is what my child needs. You may not understand this, but I'm a parent. I understand my child. I know what they need, and this is so. Let me communicate this to you, and please, I'm asking you for some help here. So kind of that's the approach I would take, and so I would start with the teacher. If you can, I always suggest kind of dropping by as much as possible right after school hours, if possible. I know this is not possible for a lot of parents. If you can't do that, make an appointment at a time that works for you. Maybe do it once a month, every couple of weeks, and just kind of keep at it, and try to understand um, the reasons why this communication isn't happening. Is it because they don't know it's a good idea? Is it because they don't want to, like they don't feel like they have to? Are they a bad teacher? Like establish it. It kind of depends. Again, it depends on context. So I just work to understand the reasons for it and then try to address those reasons and, chat with the principal, chat with the teacher, depending on what you find out. It's kind of hard. Yeah, it's a bit hard to say much more than that without knowing more about the situation.
No, I appreciate that. It also makes me think of just different communication styles. So maybe one school did it through a communication binder, but maybe when asked, the new school might prefer to do it via email, for example. So maybe it's helpful would be helpful to reach out and ask kind of what would be the easiest, or make a suggestion of what would be the easiest. And I think too, and why it's helpful, how it's helpful to the parent, and the caregiver and the student to have, an ongoing communication plan kind of thing. So that's great. Thank you for that. And the response also is just this idea, like you said, about trying to approach it in terms of bringing people into your values bubble versus always feeling, as the caregiver has mentioned in the chat as well, kind of like you're bumping heads with people, which can be such a challenge and an ongoing thing, I know, for parents, and I know through my own experience as well. So can appreciate that. We don't have a ton of time left, so I'm going to ask you a couple shorter ones that maybe would be easier ones to answer. There was a question about children as young as kindergarten. Do they get an IEP as young as kindergarten, or when does that process generally start?
So these are the kind of questions that I'm not so good at.
No problem.
Um, I don't see why not. I'm gonna, without knowing for sure, without having the information in front of me, I'm gonna say yes. But even if I'm incorrect on that, I don't think I am. That doesn't stop a parent from asking for accommodations.
Okay.
Um,
And there are comments in the chat of other people saying yes, they've heard of kids or had kids who have had IEPs at a younger age. So
great.
um, it sounds like it's more of a now putting forward the question to the school and making that request. Is that kind of what you would say?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Some other people say, yes, we had one, but we had to ask for it.
Right. Okay.
So,
Parents are
yeah.
always the experts. They're always the best.
Yeah, no problem. And this one may be along those lines, and it'll be my last one. And I see the chat's been really active, and it's really great because you referenced family support networks and how family support networks can be a great way for parents and caregivers to get connected to other families who are sometimes at the same stage. Going through a lot of the same challenges within, navigating the education system. And sometimes you're getting connected with families who have gone through it or are in different stages, further along perhaps in years. And so I just love that learning that can happen between families. And I see it in the chat right now with families supporting each other with, suggestions or sharing their experiences. So I think that's great. My last question with 4 minutes, again, another general question is, and if you can't comment on it, there's no problem, but kind of like, do you know when and how and what the expectation is or what the possibilities are for parents to request kind of information from previous years that are shared that are included in a child's file or anything like that future teachers might see or that they may be able to reference? You've talked a lot about advocacy and how can they get the information that is on their student file so that they can use it perhaps for that advocacy or at least planning for the future.
Right. Parents certainly have a right to access their child's Ontario student record. There is information in our guide that goes into more detail on that. And the other side of that is that I'm pretty sure you can access the Ontario student record and ask for things to be removed. If there are things in there that you are not happy with that paint your child in a negative light. So yeah, have a look at the guide and then just look up Ontario school, student record on the ministry website to learn more about that. I'm not an expert on that one.
Yeah, no, thank you. And it's been confirmed again by a parent caregiver in the chat that they had asked to review it and made an appointment with guidance. So I think that means high school age and have had the opportunity to change things, remove things. So thank you for sharing that, Sean. And I just want to say thank you again for your time joining us today and sharing your expertise, sharing a lot about the guide and its value and how parents and caregivers can use it to help, point them in the right direction when they're facing challenges or struggling to navigate. As you can be, we referenced the school system can be complex and confusing for anyone and everyone. So having a guide like this can be, super helpful in getting steps into the right direction. So thank you so much for joining us.